Welcome back. Now that we're all caught up on how the English colonies came to exist and thrive in North America, let's take a look at how the colonies went to war for their freedom from England and ultimately formed the United States of America. In this unit, we will cover multiple topics, and by the end, you should be able to agree with each of these three statements. I can identify the reasons why the colonies went to war with Great Britain as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. I can identify the various roles played by whites, enslaved African Americans, free African Americans, and American Indians in the Revolutionary War era, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and James Lafayette. And I can identify the importance of the Battle of Great Bridge, the Ride of Jack Jouett, and the American victory at Yorktown. Now let's take a look at a list of important vocabulary for our American Revolution unit. Revolution is a sudden change in political power when the people revolt against the government. A militia is a group of local civilians trained as soldiers who serve in emergencies. Representatives are people or groups that have the power to speak on behalf of a larger group of citizens. Parliament is an assembly of people who participate in the ruling of the country. Patriots are colonists who went against the king during the American Revolution. Loyalists are people who remained loyal to the King of England. Neutrals are people not taking any side or having a particular opinion. And volunteers offer to do something for free for a community or to benefit a cause. So up until this point in history, the American colonists were very happy to be considered British citizens, even though most had never lived in England or even visited. There were a lot of benefits, most notably the protection provided by the British military. But by the mid-1700s, British and French colonists were beginning to fight over land. Both countries had considerable land amassed in North America, and as people moved westward, conflicts occurred. Native Americans were forced to choose sides, and most chose the French. It seemed like the lesser of two evils. For years, the two countries fought, and the French usually won. Great Britain couldn't have this, though, so they poured money into weapons and troops to win this war, but they didn't have the money to do it. Ultimately, the British won a single but decisive battle and won the French and Indian War. France surrendered to Britain and lost most of its North American territory. This map illustrates what the territories looked like before the French and Indian War and afterwards. What do you notice? Yay! Let's celebrate! Great Britain and the colonies won, right? They've got all this new land and the French are out of the way. But wait, what about all of the debt they racked up trying to pay for the war? And they've got to pay to maintain the land they've just taken from France. What does a country do when they go into debt? It taxes its citizens, and that's exactly what Great Britain did. British Parliament began to tax its people in Britain and in America. First with the Sugar Act, and then the Stamp Act, which taxed items made on paper like books, newspapers, and playing cards. They had to have a stamp on them indicating the tax had been paid. Next came the Townshend Acts, which taxed glass, paint, and tea. After much protest from the colonies, most of the taxes were repealed, meaning gotten rid of, except for the Tea Act. Britain thought this was their opportunity to find middle ground. They made one brand of British tea much cheaper than any other, and then added the tax to it. That way, Britain could collect the tax, and the colonists could still get tea cheaper than before. However, this hurt trade in the eyes of the colonists. In many ways, both sides had the best of intentions, but neither side was listening to the other. Take a look at this chart to see how their perspectives differed. For the American colonies, England was 3,000 miles away, and it took 3 months to travel one way. It was not practical to send representatives to Parliament, and it was unfair to be taxed by a group in which they had no representation or say. They believed that local assemblies, not Parliament, should have the right to tax them, and no one else. On the part of Parliament, a lot of the fighting during the French and Indian War had occurred on American soil, and colonists had benefited from the protection of British soldiers. Why shouldn't they contribute to the cost of their protection? Parliament strongly believed that it had the legal authority to tax the colonies as it saw fit in order to pay off its debt. As a result of the differing opinions, there was unrest across the 13 colonies, but it was most notable in Boston, Massachusetts. In March 1770, a snowball, just a snowball, was thrown at a British soldier during a protest. British soldiers ended up firing into the crowd, killing 5 Americans. This became known as the Boston Massacre and would lead to further trouble. Then, on December 16, 1773, in the middle of the night, colonists boarded a British ship dressed as Indians and dumped 342 cases of tea into the Boston harbor. They were protesting British interference with their trade. As they dumped the tea, they yelled, "No more taxes." Of course, it didn't end there. Britain wouldn't tolerate such bad behavior from its colonies. In retaliation for the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed new laws directed at Massachusetts in 1774. They were dubbed the Coercive Acts because they were meant to force colonists to behave. These laws closed Boston's port for trade until the tea was paid off. Limits were placed on the Massachusetts legislature, and some colonists had to feed and house British soldiers. In addition, the Quebec Act set rules for the lands in the Ohio Valley that had just been acquired from the French. It stated that colonists were not allowed to settle westward and the land would be left for the Native Americans to settle. Colonists nicknamed these new laws the Intolerable Acts. In order to try and achieve peace, leaders from all of the colonies except for Georgia met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1774. There, they wrote a letter to King George explaining their position, hoping for understanding on his part. Instead, the king sent more soldiers to force their silence. When it became clear to the colonies that there would be no agreement, some people in Massachusetts began to stockpile weapons for the impending war. In April 1775, British soldiers intended to seize the colonists' supplies. Paul Revere and 2 others rode all night on horseback to warn the people of Massachusetts that the British were coming. The following day, the Patriot militia was waiting for the British soldiers in Lexington, Massachusetts, and the first shots of the Revolution rang out. At this point, war was inevitable. The Second Continental Congress met in May 1775 to form a Continental Army and appointed George Washington as commander-in-chief. His experiences in the French and Indian War would be invaluable to the colonists. It was at this time that many colonists started to believe that freedom was worth dying for. One very important Virginian during this trying time was Patrick Henry. He was a sort of jack of all trades before finding his way into the public eye. Before he was 24 years old, he had owned a general store, been a farmer, and worked at a tavern before deciding to go to law school and become a lawyer. After that, he became a vital member of Virginia's government. He loudly protested taxation without representation to the point that his peers feared he would be arrested. He is most famous today for a speech in which he said, "And as for me, give me liberty or give me death." One of Patrick Henry's most disliked enemies was Lord Dunmore. In 1775, the Revolution made its way into Virginia. The village of Great Bridge was built along the only road leading from the south to the Norfolk Harbor. Lord Dunmore tried to use this to his advantage. The Patriots would be terrified at the sight of his well-trained soldiers in their red uniforms. However, there was one thing that Lord Dunmore hadn't planned for. The narrowness of the bridge forced Dunmore's troops to cross in rows of 6, allowing the Virginians to easily kill them as they approached. After only 30 minutes of fighting, over 100 British soldiers had been killed, but only 1 Virginian had been slightly injured. Lord Dunmore was forced to flee Norfolk, and soon he left Virginia for good. After several years of fighting, the colonies were ready to claim their freedom. The Second Continental Congress met during the summer of 1776. Leaders from across the colonies nominated Thomas Jefferson for a very important job, writing the document which would cut ties with Great Britain. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and on July 4th, 1776, it was read for the world to hear. A copy was sent to Great Britain as well. This document listed the reasons for the colony's independence and stated that the right to govern belonged to the people, not to kings. Most famously, Jefferson wrote that people deserve the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. One of the pitfalls of any war is that it forces people to choose sides. During the American Revolution, people could be patriots, meaning they were fighting for American freedom, loyalists who sided with Great Britain, or they could remain neutral and not take a side. There were two groups in particular that had to make a choice. Africans and Native Americans were divided amongst themselves. Some slaves sided with Britain because they were promised their freedom. However, after the war, they were forced to leave the country because Britain had lost. Many went to Canada, England, or Africa. Others fought with the colonists, some by choice, and others were sent in place of their masters. Native Americans were split as well. They knew that neither side was going to leave their land, and they would be forced out either way. Women played a major role in the war on both sides. Many traveled with the soldiers, some fighting on the front lines, and others cooking and sewing and serving as nurses. The women who stayed home took on the responsibilities of the men who had left for battle, running farms, shops, and businesses. One notable African from Virginia ended up being one of the war's best spies. James Armistead asked his master's permission to fight in the war. He ended up serving under French General the Marquis de Lafayette. Together, they came up with a plan for Armistead to pretend to be a runaway slave spying for the British. Only he was really going to spy on the British. He gave false information to the British soldiers while giving real intelligence to the Patriots. At the end of the war, he was granted his freedom, and Armistead chose to change his name to James Armistead Lafayette to honor the French general he had served. Lafayette wasn't the only hero of the war, though. In June 1781, a man named Jack Jouett overheard a group of British soldiers plotting the capture of Thomas Jefferson and other members of the Virginia General Assembly in Charlottesville. Knowing the terrible consequences that would have, Jouett rode on horseback through the night to warn Jefferson of the plan. Thanks to him, they were able to narrowly escape arrest. Amidst all of this chaos, Virginia made an important decision to move the capital. For years, the population had been moving westward, and Richmond is a more central location in the state, but the biggest concern was that Williamsburg was an easy target for British attack. As a result, in 1780, the capital officially relocated to Richmond. A year later, the Revolution had been raging for 6 years straight, and it was looking bad for the American colonies. The British had taken firm control of New York City, and General Cornwallis was leading troops through the South, winning battle after battle. To make matters worse for Virginians, the British had recently taken control of Richmond after a huge win. But after a Patriot win in Saratoga, the French saw an opportunity to get back at England for the French and Indian War. In 1778, France signed a treaty with the United States, and thousands of French troops immediately began pouring into the country. General Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau hatched a plan. While Washington wanted to attack New York, Rochambeau saw an opportunity in Virginia. The British had recently been forced out of the Carolinas, and he felt that with the right strategy they could win big. So the French Navy surprised the British fleet at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay on September 5th, 1781. As you can see in this map, the French cut off British troops and supply ships from reaching Yorktown. With supplies cut off and reinforcements no longer coming, 17,000 French and American soldiers surrounded General Cornwallis's troops. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender this battle. This was not the end of the war, but it was the last major battle and was ultimately the determining factor in the outcome. As part of the formal surrender, British soldiers lined up along Hampton Road. As a military band played, and on command, they threw their weapons into the middle of the field. General Cornwallis refused to be there, however, and he sent a lower-ranking official to formally surrender. George Washington, insulted by this action, also sent a lower-ranking official to accept the surrender. It wasn't until 2 years later, though, on September 3rd, 1783, that the war was officially over. It all came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, which recognized the United States of America as an independent country. Now that a country existed, how would it be run? And by whom? All of these questions and more will be answered in our next unit.